Hi, everyone. Welcome to Black History Quest, Oregon Black Pioneers History Research and Conversation Program, sponsored by the Collins Foundation. My name is, of course, Mariah Rocker, and I'm your host for this evening. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to learn a little bit more about Oregon's Black history. We're coming to you live on Oregon Black Pioneers Facebook and YouTube pages. If you can't stay around for the whole show, don't worry. You'll be able to find this and every episode of Black History Quest on the Oregon Black Pioneers YouTube page. But what is Oregon Black Pioneers? Well, we're Oregon's only statewide nonprofit dedicated to preserving and promoting the experiences of people of African descent. Since 1993, we've illuminated this seldom told history through a variety of ways, including publications, exhibits, free lesson plans that are available to download on our website, and programs like this one. This is our 16th episode of Black History Quest, and BHQ is an Oregon Black Pioneers original program with the goal of uncovering more of Oregon's Black history. With the help of the Collins Foundation, OBP supports local researchers, or history investigators, as we call them, as they dive deep into a single source and share their findings here on our virtual show. We're working to deepen our understanding of Oregon's Black history, one episode at a time. Join us live every other month to find out about this new research and get a peek behind the scenes at what this research actually looks like. Every episode is archived on our YouTube channel, so hello and thanks in advance to the fellow Oregon Black pioneers who are watching in the future. And for those of us joining live, don't forget to share your questions in the chat section of the live stream so that we can discuss them on air after the presentation. Now, without further ado, let's get started with tonight's show. We're lucky to have Anna Sloan as this episode's history investigator. Anna Sloan is the Curator of Collections for the Southern Oregon Historical Society, SOHS, and a research archaeologist with the Southern Oregon University Laboratory of Anthropology, or SULA. She received her PhD in anthropology for archaeology and a graduate certificate in museum studies from the University of Oregon in 2021. Histories of social identity, including race, gender, sexuality, and their intersections, were the focus of her academic studies. Anna is excited to bring this research focus to her work in Southern Oregon, where she has the distinct fortune of getting to work with diverse and multi-form material culture collections, from the smallest of pottery sherds to the largest of wagon wheels. She lives in Ashland with her family and a growing menagerie of four-legged friends. So I'm excited to have Anna Sloan join us tonight. Hi.
Hey there, Mariah.
Hi, Anna. How's it going?
It's going great. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. We're so excited to have you. Thank you for joining on to be one of our history investigators. Now, as you know, we begin all of our history investigations with a source that was sparked by an interest. So, can you start by telling us what source you were looking into and what it was about it that caught your attention?
Absolutely. So I'll get into more detail about this source in my talk, but essentially, this is an online catalog entry for a photograph that's housed at the Douglas County Museum, in which the photo caption references a Hanley family member and a connection to slavery. And it's actually owing to Zachary Stocks, your own Zachary Stocks from Oregon
Oh,
Black Pioneers. Hi, Zachary, if you're there, for bringing this source to our attention. And because the Hanleys are a prominent Southern Oregon family, and one also whose story we interpret really heavily at one of our historic sites,
right.
myself and my colleagues at SOHS, we were really intrigued about this source and definitely wanted to learn more.
Sure. That totally makes sense. That is, given that you're so deeply embedded with the Hanley family, to hear that there's something that you're not familiar with, you must have been like, oh, this, we've got to learn more. Um,
Absolutely.
so what sorts of questions did you have about the source, and what were you thinking it might represent before we dive into all the nitty-gritty details?
I mean, off the bat, well, I mean, first of all, so many questions. But off the bat, I think a lot of us were just wondering, what is this source? How can we verify its accuracy? What other information exists actually with the photograph to be able to tell
Mm,
where that information came from, because these
Sure.
things can be really tricky when items are sort of in archives. It can be hard to tell where some of like the metadata associated with them came from. So that was a
Mhm.
big question to start. And that's sort of how I began my search, is like, well, let's first try to verify the accuracy. And that search took me into the archives of SOHS, but also the archives of
Sure.
the Douglas County Museum, as well as into an online search of census records. And I'm excited today to just share all that I was able to find. I did find quite a bit of relevant information on the subject.
Awesome. Awesome. Okay. Well, I think we're now all pretty intrigued to learn more. So I'll turn it over to you to present and share this information.
Great, thank you. Okay, so our big question here, were the Hanleys of Southern Oregon enslavers? Before sort of diving into the way that I answered this question, I want to briefly lay the groundwork for who the Hanley family are and how they relate to us at SOHS, because as I mentioned earlier, we have sort of a tight connection. So first of all, our historical society, Southern Oregon Historical Society, is a regional historical society. We've been around since 1946. Our focus is preserving history of Southern Oregon writ large, although we began with more of a Jackson County specific focus. And the Hanley family actually played a central role in getting SOHS started. Women of sort of the most recent Hanley generation, Claire and Mary, were some of the founders of our organization. Claire was our first president. Mary was our first curator. There are some photos of them up on the screen, and in the middle there with their sister Martha. And they were very active in society operations all the way from the 1940s up through the 1960s. Claire passed away in the 60s, but Mary lived until the 1980s, and she was active up until that time. When she passed, Mary was living at the family homestead, which is Hanley Farm, and upon her death, she deeded that property to SOHS to be used essentially as a living history farm. So today, we own and operate that facility. It's a National Register historic site, it's an archaeological site, it's a century farm, and we do a lot of our public outreach events at this location. So things like summer events. In the springtime, we have our big fourth grade field trip. Kids come and do sort of pioneer activities out there. We offer tours of the historic house. So a lot of interpretation happens at this place. And of course, today we're focusing on Hanley family history, which is what we interpret out at the farm. So I want to start by just talking about the little slice of this history that is part and parcel of sort of what we talk about at the farm. And then we'll move on to the slice that I'm going to focus more on for the talk today and how they're interrelated. I always like to show some photographs so that you can put some names with faces before I get into the nitty-gritty of the names. Okay, so all the way on the left side, you'll see our sort of earliest generation of Hanleys that we interpret at SOHS, Martha and Michael Hanley. Pay attention to Martha because she's really the center of our story. So both these folks are pioneers that traveled the Oregon Trail separately, and then they met and married in 1854 in Douglas County. They came down to Jackson County in 1857. Michael Hanley bought an original land claim from the Clinton and Welton families and set up his own family farm. So that's that homestead place that I'm talking about that we still own at SOHS. Michael Hanley was a big rancher, big agricultural sort of stock guy in our region. So Martha and Michael's eldest surviving daughter is pictured there in the middle. That's Alice Hanley. And she took over the farm after her parents' deaths in the late 1880s. Alice never married, never had kids, ran the farm single-handedly, but with a lot of help from outside laborers until her own death in 1940. And then all the way on the right side, you'll see Alice's nieces pictured. So these are the daughters of her brother John, another player in our story. And you can see there Mary, Martha, and Claire. So these three girls were orphaned in the early 1900s and sent off to live with various relatives that were located across Oregon. Claire Hanley, all the way on the right-hand side, ended up coming to live with her Aunt Alice at Hanley Farm. Later in time, Mary joined her living there. And again, these are the folks who were really instrumental in getting SOHS set up at the beginning. So the stories of these Hanley relatives have tended to be those that we've focused on at Hanley Farm when we're doing our interpretation, but the story today focuses on somewhat of an earlier branch of the family tree, primarily the parents and grandparents of Martha Burnett Hanley. So let's talk a little bit about her family now. So all the way on the right-hand side, you see Martha's eldest son. That's John A. Hanley. So John is the older brother of Alice. John is the father of Mary, Martha, and Claire Hanley. And he also plays an important role in our story today, although he was a baby at the time. So his mother, Martha, again, sort of our central figure is pictured there, Martha Burnett Hanley. Her parents were John Sims Burnett and Lydia Danforth Burnett, two folks who came across the Oregon Trail with their family, including a young Martha, in the early 1850s and sort of set up shop in Douglas County. And then I also have referenced Lydia Danforth Burnett's parents, Josiah Danforth, and someone who we believe was called Sarah Ron, although we don't have as much information about her. But this is sort of like the earliest generation of this family in the US. And Josiah Danforth will also come into play in our story today. So just to emphasize, the main sort of cast of characters for today's talk are going to be Martha Burnett Hanley, her parents, John Sims Burnett and Lydia Danforth Burnett, and then Lydia's father, Josiah Danforth. Okay. So let's talk about the source here. The way that this came to light for us is that one day, myself and my wonderful colleague, Jan Wright, who's our archivist at SOHS, received an email from Zachary saying, oh my gosh, we've stumbled upon this source. An intern of ours at Oregon Black Pioneers came across this online, and it's a reference to a person being enslaved by a member of the Hanley family. He reached out to us because he knows our connection with the Hanley family at SOHS, and he said, do you have any other information about this source? And at the time, we did not. So we were really intrigued to learn more. Let's take a closer look at what this source actually is. So I have here just an image that's pulled from the actual website, as you can see it, of the Douglas County Museum. This is a photograph that's in their collection. It's photo number N2599. This is its online catalog record, so it has all sorts of metadata attached to it on the bottom. And this guy should look familiar. We've just seen his photo in the family tree. It's John Hanley. So again, that eldest child of Martha and Michael, the brother of Alice, the father of Martha, Mary, and Claire. And what's interesting about this photo, again, is the story that's told in its sort of description field here. So I'm going to read this out to you here. So the remarks about this photo. John A. Hanley, son of Mr. and Mrs. Michael Hanley, born at Winchester, 1855. As a baby, he was carried on the back of his mother's slave girl, his mother carrying a rifle, while the three hid out in the woods during the Indian troubles of 1855 to 56. Whoa. What a piece of information, right? So the reference here to the possibility of the Hanley family being enslavers. If the young woman who is referenced here was enslaved by Martha Hanley, that leads us to very many further questions. And that's the subject of the talk today. Does evidence exist to back up this claim? What do we know about the Hanley family's slaveholding status? This was a history that when we sort of poked around at SOHS, there were a few volunteers who in the past had come across that reference online, but nobody had ever really followed up to find out what the reality was. So it was a welcome opportunity to explore this question for Black History Quest. And I'm just really grateful to Zachary and Mariah and the whole team at Black Pioneers for letting me do this, because this is really adding to our understanding of some of the interpretation that we do down here. Okay, so the big question, were the Hanleys of Southern Oregon enslavers? I'm going to pause briefly here and just talk about this talk title because it's been through a few iterations and it's a good learning moment to share. So when I began this research, I was first inclined to describe my big question as, what was the slaveholding status of the Hanley family? Mariah gently suggested an alternative, which is, were the Hanleys enslavers? And that's a much more active way of describing what we're talking about here. The act of enslaving versus being slaveholders, right? It's a powerful shift, and you can even sort of hear it when you hear the two next to each other, right? And what it does is it introduces more humanizing language, right? This notion of a person, an enslaved person versus a slave. We can now see how the term enslaved person really emphasizes the fact that this was not a choice. It was something that was forced upon people. And the term enslavers really emphasizes that act of enforcement. So, in general, using this language of enslavement points more deeply to the agency of everybody involved. And for that reason, I really like this choice for the talk. And I'm really grateful for Mariah's discussion with me about that. At the end of the talk, if anybody wants to bring up any questions about that, I think Mariah and I are both happy to talk through some of the language choices as well, if it's of interest. Okay, so our big question, how are we going to explore it? Well, the first thing that we did after receiving that message from Zachary was to hit the internet, as folks will often do. So Jan and I began to sort of scan the census records for relevant information. Okay. And we're going to sort of use Martha Burnett Hanley as our anchor here, okay, because she is really the subject of that photo caption, the person that we're interested in learning more about, whether or not she in particular was an enslaver. The anecdote that's mentioned in that photo caption takes place in 1855, so square in the middle of two census years. So we can bump forward in time from 1855 to 1860 and look at that census, and we can bump back to 1850 and look at that one. Let's start with 1860, 5 years after that described incident. So again, we're looking here for sort of evidence of the Hanley family, and we see them listed here in Jackson County. We see Michael, Martha, their 3 kids at the time. There's a young John Hanley. He was the baby in that photo caption, or the baby described in the photo caption, right? He was 4 in 1860. We see 2 other kids there. Alice Hanley is one of them. She's 1 year old. We see 4 laborers listed underneath the Hanley family, but none of them are described as being Black. And we do know that the Hanleys employed people for farm labor regularly throughout the history of the farmstead. And some of them even lived on the property with the family. So we're not super surprised to see that. But we do not see any enslaved people listed in the Hanley household on this census at this time. Okay, so interesting. Let's take a look back a little bit further in time to 1850 and see what we see. Now, this was a really different time because Martha and Michael Hanley were not yet married. Martha Hanley is actually Martha Burnett at this point in time. She's 17 years old. She's still a part of her father's household. And in fact, the family has not even migrated to Oregon yet. They're still in Missouri, which is where they spent a good chunk of time. So when we look at the 1850 census record for Wright County, Missouri, we also actually see no enslaved people listed as part of this household. Okay, we see Martha and her siblings listed here, her parents, John and Lydia, but it looks like no enslaved people. Now, there's something to realize, though, about this census, right? The 1850 census in Missouri is only listing free inhabitants. And here I'm really indebted to my colleague, Jan, who has decades of experience researching Black Oregonians, who pointed out to me that, you're going to want to look for something called the slave schedule in correspondence to the 1850 census in Missouri. So slave schedules were population schedules for enslaved Black people that accompanied the 1850 and 1860 censuses. They listed enslaved people separately and not named, but with the people who were enslaving them as well. Okay, so what do we see when we look for the slave schedule that accompanies this census record? Here it is. We see a Mrs. L. Burnett. That's Lydia Danforth Burnett, Martha Burnett Hanley's mother. And here she's listed as enslaving 2 people in Missouri. Okay. The first is a 21-year-old Black woman, and the second is a 1-year-old baby girl of mixed race. Whoa, there it is. Our first really solid evidence that a Hanley relative, the mother of Martha Hanley, enslaved people. And even though, it sort of seems that the information provided here is scant, we don't have names, we don't have a lot of demographic information, there is still a lot to parse out from this source. First of all, I don't think it's a big leap to assume that the little girl listed here is the daughter of the older enslaved woman listed on this schedule. It's also of note that this 1-year-old baby is listed as mixed race, and the other enslaved woman is listed as Black. So this is difficult, but we know that sexual violence and coercion were parts of chattel slavery, and it's possible. This is, again, possibility, not something that we can prove, that this child was born out of non-consensual intercourse. That's an assumption, but we know that this did happen as a part of this terrible, terrible part of history. We also see that the enslaved woman here is listed as being 21 years old in 1850. And this is the year that Martha Burnett Hanley is 17 years old. So this enslaved woman in her family's household is almost an age mate to her, around the same age, okay? So with this direct evidence of enslaved people as part of the Burnett household, let's now look at what the Burnetts were up to in the census in 1860, okay, rather than the Hanleys. So this would have been the household in 1860 that about 5 years prior, Martha had left to become a Hanley. Again, she married Michael in 1854, and then they eventually traveled south to Jackson County. So Martha Burnett Hanley and Michael are actually not even living in Douglas County, close to her parents at this time, but her father is still in Douglas County. At this point in time, her mother Lydia has passed away, but her father maintains a household with a few of her siblings. And we see something very interesting here. Under John Sims Burnett, again, we've got 2 siblings of Martha Burnett Hanley, and then we have a young Black girl, Lily, aged 11, okay? This is a young person who it said was born in Missouri. I wish I was better at reading script because I can't for the life of me make out what it says next to her name here. This is a great, if anybody is skilled in deciphering handwriting, please take a stab at this. But again, here we have a member of the Burnett household who is a Black person. I believe that this is probably the same person as that 1-year-old baby girl that's listed in the slave schedules of 1850 as being associated with the family. Clearly, at this point in time, the older enslaved woman is not a part of the household. So what's the story here? What happened to her? The questions are starting to multiply. To get even more context on the Burnett family, we can look further back in time. So now we're going to bounce back to 1840. And this is when the Burnetts were still back in Missouri. The census record here is less detailed in terms of names, but we do have demographic information for members of the Burnett household, okay? So here we see listed John Sims Burnett. We see listed a woman in her 40s, that's his wife, Lydia. We see 2 teenage sons, James and Josiah, 1 younger son, Andrew, and 1 younger daughter, who's Martha, the future Martha Hanley, who at this point in time is only about 7 years old. And then we see 2 little kids, Martha Hanley's younger sisters, Letitia and Mary. Off on the right, we see that there is 1 enslaved person in this household, this time a young man, aged between 10 and 24 years. Okay, so further evidence that the Burnett family enslaved people, and this is a different enslaved person than the woman and young girl that we see in 1850. So further back in time, it's harder to locate the right John S. Burnett in census records. I have a few suspected matches on the 1830 census for Tennessee, which is where the family was living at this time. But there are a few discrepancies in the household numbers that give me pause. However, I think it's fair to say that we have pretty solid evidence at this point that when Martha Burnett Hanley was growing up, her family enslaved people. We can look further back in time for this family by exploring genealogical records. And this is an interesting point because what is pictured here is actually the application that Mary Hanley, again, that most recent generation of Hanley women submitted to the Daughters of the American Revolution for membership in the group based on her family's genealogy, which traces the same line through the Burnett family to the Danforths and back to Josiah Danforth, who lived here during the time of the Revolution. Okay, so interesting to me that we have this parallel here, and this is an area where we need to do more research because some of this genealogy needs to be sussed out a bit more, and we'll get to more information about Josiah Danforth further along in the talk. So all of this thus far has just been sourced from census records that we were able to find through sort of our usual databases online. And it was fruitful, but Jan and I, of course, were itching to get into the actual Hanley family archives housed at SOHS to see what else comes up here. And here's a point where having a family that really were museum people from the start, like the Hanleys were. They kept meticulous records. They did a really nice job of preserving their family's history and preserving the documents that detailed their experiences. They inventoried them, they housed them nicely, and they tucked them away at SOHS and even in other archives for folks to find later. So we're grateful for that the Hanleys did that and had that sensibility, because we really do have a well-documented record for this family. I wasn't sure what I'd find here, though, because, histories of enslavement can be difficult for families to grapple with, especially knowing how entrenched the Hanleys were at SOHS. Is this part of the history that they would have taken out of the archives and not included in their family's story? Because certainly all of this was left here by them. And there were some surprises in there in terms of that for me. But in any case, we started looking in the archives at SOHS to see what we could find. So first we find another retelling of that story that's detailed in that photo caption. The story of baby John Hanley and his mother Martha Hanley escaping into the hills during the start of the Rogue River Wars. But in this version, in this handwritten version, there's actually no mention of an enslaved person being with them. So somewhat of a dead end to start. But we kept looking, and then, an amazing piece of information. So handwritten on the back of an envelope, we have a brief retelling of the family's history that provides us with a wealth of information. This states that, quote, John Sims Burnett and family came to Douglas County in 1853 from Missouri and brought enslaved girls for servants. They married white men later on in time, is sort of what it says at the end there. So, oh my goodness, a huge clue here. My suspicion is that this is a scrawling actually by Mary Hanley when she was doing research into her family's records. And who knows where she, particularly got this information. It might have been her own recollection of a family story. It might have been a conversation with someone else that she just wanted to take down quickly. But again, this fills in some of the gaps for us. From this, we know that John Sims Burnett and his family, including young Martha, would have traveled across the Oregon Trail with enslaved girls with them, plural, okay, as described here. And then we have this really interesting clue that later on they married white men. Oh my goodness, where could we take that? Okay, so this was really exciting to find this. Let's see what else we can find in the Hanley family archives. We see something further back in time that really does end up being a smoking gun, as they say. This is a slave bill of sale for John Sims Burnett. And once more, my handwriting warrior says, please come forth for further research, because this is another piece that's sort of difficult to make out exactly what it states. But what I could make out from it is this, quote, April the 19th, 1829. I took of John S. Burnett $200 for a Negro girl, presumably, aged 8 years. And there are a few other words in there that I wasn't able to make out, and another statement about the quality of the person before it's signed by the person who presumably is the seller. So solid evidence for John S. Burnett purchasing an enslaved person in 1829. This would have been the time when the Burnett family was living in Tennessee, about 10 years after John and Lydia got married. This would have been prior to Martha's birth, but only by a few years. Looking even further back in time in the Hanley family archives, we find another receipt that details the sale of an enslaved person to a Hanley family member. This is from that sort of first, what would become a Hanley family relative, Josiah Danforth, who was born in 1753 in Massachusetts, ended up living in Virginia, and elsewhere later after that. But this receipt explains that, quote, one Negro boy for, I'm presuming, $7 was purchased along with other items. Okay. So solid evidence here for the grandfather of Martha Burnett Hanley also as being an enslaver. So more pieces of the puzzle were coming together. We now have very solid evidence that the Burnett and earlier Danforth families were enslavers. So recall again that these are the parents and grandparents of Martha Burnett Hanley. New parts of the story are starting to emerge, but in terms of the Hanley family, right, like for Martha Hanley, during her older life and after she got married, we don't have a clear picture yet of her involvement as an enslaver. Okay, so still a bit of a lack of information. Okay, so the search continues. It was finally time for me to go back directly to the original source, that image from the online catalog record. So again, this is not housed at SOHS. This is actually up at the Douglas County Museum, the area of Oregon close, Roseburg, where John Sims Burnett and Lydia Danforth Burnett came and settled their family in 1853. Actually where Martha and Michael Hanley met and lived for about 3 years before heading down to Jackson County. So there is this little chunk of Hanley family history here during the first years of their marriage. This is where Martha and Michael Hanley lived. So not surprising that there would be Hanley family materials in this archive as well. And my visit here was greatly enhanced by help from Karen and Alita at the Research Library. And I want to send them a huge thank you as well, because they were tireless in helping me find these sources and really just were great allies in the research process. So one of the first things that I wanted to do here was actually look at the picture itself, look at the photo, not for any new information about the photo, but for what I could see written on the back. One of the things that I've learned working adjacent to an archive is that even though somebody might copy down verbatim what something says into an online catalog record, looking at the thing firsthand is always or often going to give you more information, because there might be another little note scrawled in pencil that you couldn't really make out in the scan, or there might be information included in the folder with the item that wasn't a part of the metadata for the online version as well. So here I got to take a look at the photo, and I saw on the back verbatim that caption, but also the fact that this information came from Mary and Martha Hanley. So again, this is that original caption that talks about this incident in 1855 when John Hanley was a baby. He was strapped to the back of his mother's enslaved girl in Winchester as they were escaping the violence of the Rogue River Wars, right? And here we see that this information has been provided by Mary and Martha Hanley, the granddaughters of Martha. The sort of third generation Martha that we're talking about. Okay, so again, great additional source of information. Pretty soon, we also stumbled upon where that little reference to Mary and Martha must have actually come from. It's a summary of an interview that was done by a Douglas County Museum employee with Martha and Mary Hanley themselves in 1972. So this is great because, again, it gives us a little bit more information. And I'm going to find my slide elsewhere here so that I can read this one out to you. So we see here about halfway down the summary, they state that Quote, Martha Burnett Hanley had brought a slave girl to Oregon from Tennessee. Okay, so they actually get that part a little bit wrong. The family came from Missouri rather than Tennessee, although, of course, we've seen that they did live in Tennessee prior to that time. But here is information coming directly in the form of like oral history transmission from Martha and Mary Hanley pertaining to their grandmother's history, and then filed away here at the Douglas County Museum. So this was extremely interesting because now we're starting to see Martha being named a bit more in the narrative here by people that knew her. So Martha, again, is sort of described as being the one who brought this person with them to Oregon, as being the enslaver herself. We also have the source of the story here. We see that this wasn't just sort of community gossip. This was actually coming from Hanley family members themselves, this information about their family's connection to histories of enslavement. And it furthered my understanding greatly about what we were seeing here. Okay, and then we stumbled upon something that ended up being a real gem of a source, again, at the Douglas County Museum archives. So this is another little tidbit from an oral interview that would have happened a little bit later than the one previously in 1978. And this, again, it has just really important information to share. So I'm going to read this out. I'll mention too, so this slip of paper was actually not found with the Burnett family folder in the archives. It was found nestled away in the minorities vertical file. And this is why, it's great to look in every nook and cranny that you can, because this was not necessarily in with the Burnett family papers. We had to sort of look elsewhere to find it. And it ends up being a really important clue for us. Okay, so this reads, quote, John Burnett and family brought a Negro maid by the name of Lyle with them when they came to Oregon. She was the servant of the daughter who married Mike Hanley. Later, she went to San Francisco and was married there. Gordon Burnett has photos of her children, but none of her. Oh my goodness. You better believe when I read this, I jumped out of my seat. I got so excited. I sent my colleague Jan immediately a picture and a text saying, we've got a name. We've got a name. So a huge amount of information on this little slip of paper. Okay. We've got the name, presumably, for one of the women or girls that accompanied the Burnett family across the Oregon Trail. This again gives that direct connection with Martha Burnett Hanley herself, stating this was the servant of that daughter who married Mike Hanley. That's Martha. And we also get information about what happened to this person next, right? Later in time, she went to San Francisco and was married there. And then, oh my goodness, something that's incredibly exciting, the fact that a relative named Gordon Burnett actually might have photos of this person's children, but none of her. Okay, so just incredibly exciting. And then to sort of wrap up my evidence here, this is more of a context building piece, but I was interested to see this as well. They've got lots of great newspapers on microfilm at Douglas County Museum, and we were able to find this little tidbit from the May 24th, 1862 edition of the Oregon Sentinel. And it's an article, sort of a satirical piece titled Dixie Democrats, wherein a reporter goes up to Roseburg to sort of survey the community at the time as to their sympathies during the Civil War. And he's saying that a lot of the folks who made their homesteads up there were Confederate sympathizers. And in this article, he actually calls John Sims Burnett out by name. You can't really read it very legibly on the screen there, but lists him as one of these folks in support of the Confederacy. So just another dimension to the story here that really sort of enhances what we have heard and already know. Okay, so now we know enough to somewhat put a story together here. So let me summarize the evidence and what we think we know. We're going to start way back in time with Josiah Danforth, born in Massachusetts in 1753, after that lived in Virginia. During his lifetime, he enslaved Black people, and we know this because of that handwritten receipt His daughter, Lydia Danforth Burnett, would therefore have been brought up in a home that included enslaved people. In 1818, when Lydia Danforth was 22, she married John Sims Burnett in Tennessee. It's possible that because she came from a household that enslaved people, she might have brought some of those enslaved people with her into that marriage. In 1829, John Sims Burnett bought and enslaved a young woman who, it looks like, based on the bill of sale, was 8 years old at the time. Sometime in the early 1830s, the Burnetts moved from Tennessee to Missouri. Their daughter Martha was born there in 1832. She grew up there with her parents and several siblings. At the time of her birth, her household likely had at least one enslaved person, that young woman from the bill of sale in 1829. In 1840, when Martha was 7 years old, her family still lived in Missouri. There was a young enslaved boy listed in her household between the ages of 10 and 24. And then in 1850, there are two different enslaved people listed in the household who appear to be owned by her mother, Lydia Danforth. So that's the 21-year-old woman and the 1-year-old baby girl. This young woman is just a bit older than Martha at the time, so she would have lived in a household with an enslaved person that was very close to her in age. In 1848, John Sims Burnett makes his first trip across the Oregon Trail. He actually went back and forth a few times and was with some of the Kit Carson group that would go across. A little bit later in 1853, the Burnett family as a whole emigrated to Oregon by ox train and settled near Roseburg. Martha was 20 years old at this time. So as we recall, that source from the Douglas County Museum states that, quote, John Burnett and family brought a Negro maid by the name of Lyle with them when they came to Oregon. She was the servant of the daughter who married Mike Hanley. Our SOHS Hanley Family Recollections also state that slave girls, plural, came with the Burnett family across the Oregon Trail. So my guess here is that the now 24-year-old Black woman that we saw on the slave schedule in 1850 is this person named Lyle. And I think the 1-year-old, possibly Lyle's daughter, is Lily, who we will see named later in the census record. At the time of their crossing the Oregon Trail, they would have been 24 years old and 4 years old. Okay. Now, I want to point out here, Lily and Lyle are two names that have a lot of similarities. It's absolutely possible that there's some sort of conflation going on here and that the names were recollected incorrectly. And in that case, it's possible that maybe they're the same person. But I think what we're seeing based on the available evidence is that multiple enslaved girls or women came across the Oregon Trail with this family, and the census is pretty clear about the ages that these folks would have been at that time. Okay, so the Burnett family makes it to Oregon with these two enslaved women or girls. In July 1854, Martha's mother, Lydia, dies. Later that year in December, Martha marries Michael Hanley in Roseburg. We know that the older enslaved person, probably Lyle, is known to have been her servant. So when she married Michael, could she have taken this person with her into their household in Jackson County? It's possible. Just a little bit later, in October 1855, is when their first child, John Andrew Hanley, is born. The family is moved to Winchester because of the violence surrounding the Rogue River War. This is when we see the anecdote in the photo caption and in the other recollections about a baby, John Andrew Hanley, being strapped to an enslaved woman's back. At this point, I am presuming that that is Lyle. Lyle is now 26. The girl known as Lily at this point would have been 6. Now, we also know that enslaved children were made to work very early in their life, and it would not have been impossible for Lily to have been working in this household as well at that time. Okay, so I need to put that out there. And this is all still while everybody is in Douglas County. Okay, so following this anecdote, we lose track of Lyle. We don't have any further census records related to this person that I have been able to find yet. Did she go down to Jackson County with the Hanleys? Is this the person who went to California and got married? Is Lily her daughter? And if so, why would she have left her? These are all questions that we still have. Okay, we're moving down now to Jackson County. In 1857, Martha and Michael moved down to their new homestead, took over the Clinton and Welton donation land claim in Jackson County. This would become Hanley Farm, the same that is pictured in that first slide with the white farmhouse that we interpreted SOHS. Currently, there still is little existing evidence to suggest that enslaved people lived or worked at Hanley Farm. The last reference that we have for enslaved people within the Hanley family appear to be up in this Douglas County region. That's not to say that it might not have happened. We just don't have evidence currently for the Hanley family when they lived in Jackson County as having enslaved people with them. Okay, in 1860, Martha's father's household in Douglas County is listed as including that 11-year-old girl named Lily, who I'm guessing had been with the family all of that time. We know that sometime in the next decade, John Sims Burnett came down to Jackson County to live with Martha and Michael in his later years when he was in ailing health. So what happened to the people in his household? What happened to Lily at that time? We also don't know the answer to that. Lily would have been 22 at the time that John Sims Burnett would have been probably coming down to Jackson County to live in the household of Martha and Michael. Okay, and then we know that some of the information states that the enslaved young women ended up in California and married white men, but we don't know much else from there. So at this point, we can answer the question. We can answer our big question. Yes, Martha Burnett Hanley and her ancestors were enslavers. Enslaved women or girls named Lyle and Lily were in the Burnett household when they came to Oregon, and they continued to be with the family for at least their early years there. As far as we can tell, once the family came down to Jackson County, enslaved people were no longer a part of their household. Prior to that, John Sims Burnett enslaved at least another young man and a young woman, and before that, yet again, Josiah Danforth enslaved at least one person during his time too. Okay. So many questions still remain. First and foremost, in my mind, what were the experiences of these enslaved women and girls that came with the Burnett family and had been a part of their household for at least a decade, probably more than that, during this sort of middle period of the 1800s? It's hard to know. We don't know what happened to them and where they went. But we would really like to learn that information. We do have this really enticing piece of evidence to follow up on, which is, again, that note at the Douglas County Museum that there may have been pictures taken of the woman Lyle, who's named, of that person's children, right? And those are attributed to somebody named Gordon Burnett, who I'm guessing is likely the brother or nephew of the woman who was relaying that information. The woman relaying the information was a great-granddaughter of John Sims Burnett, as far as I can tell. So I've got my colleagues at Douglas County hot on the trail, hopefully, of trying to figure out who could this Gordon person be, because my goodness, we really would love to find any images that family might have of these people and sort of what happened to them afterwards. And then, as part of this research, I was curious to explore other known enslavers in Southern Oregon to give this even broader context. The Hanleys certainly were not alone in having ties to enslavement. Other prominent local families like the Abbotts, the Overbrooks, the Mast family, prominent rancher Jacob Ish, all have histories of slaveholding, some of them prior to their time in Southern Oregon, but some who came with enslaved people on their journeys west. I know currently that our colleagues at the McKee Bridge Historical Society are doing research on the Black family, that's the family name, and their story of arrival into Southern Oregon, which is very much entangled in legacies of enslavement. The 1860s were a time when much was changing in the nation, of course, and in Oregon. So for context, in 1857, the year that the Hanleys moved down to Southern Oregon. That was the year that Oregon voted on statehood in the state constitution. And at that time, 1 in 4 voters voted in favor of Oregon being a slave state, right? So all of this sort of adds to that context of understanding, and are at the forefront of questions about what it means to be an Oregonian. Also, most of the information that we have about all of these families and their legacies of enslavement is from the perspectives of the enslavers. So we have very little, if any, information about the experiences of the enslaved people. So that continues to be a big further question. Okay, I'm going to quickly move ahead with just a few more slides here. A huge question in my mind is now, what do we do with this information? As I said, Hanley Farm, it's a public place here in Southern Oregon. We interpret the family's history all the time. It's a part of what we do. So I am extremely motivated to begin including this information in our interpretations of the family. Even though we don't have, again, direct evidence for enslaved people being with the family when they came to Southern Oregon, it's still an important part of the family history. We're currently working on a small project out at the farm to make a new interpretive center in what was formerly a farm caretaker's cottage. And we're specifically talking about labor histories at the site. So this is an absolutely perfect entry to include some information out of this research. And I'm really excited to be able to do that. And the question for me becomes, when we know this, what opportunity do we lose if we don't interpret it? I think it's a huge opportunity. Especially because I think some of us in Southern Oregon have struggled to find links to histories of enslavement in terms of the families and sort of how to interpret this. A perfect example is that I've had the book pictured here, Interpreting Slavery at Museums and Historic Sites, one of these great books from the AASLH book series, on my bookshelf in my office since I began my job as curator several years ago. And I always thought, it's not really relevant to how I'm interpreting things. We don't necessarily have histories of slavery and enslavement that I'm interpreting as part of my job. Well, what do you know? Now this has become a really important nexus for interpretation for us. If to answer the question, how has this work changed our understandings of local history? For me, first, it has brought to light a direct connection between the Hanley family's history and chattel slavery that was previously not a part of how we have understood the family. In terms of pioneer families, it reiterates the fact that folks came to Oregon with this as part and parcel of their experience, and that didn't just leave once they settled here, right? When we interpret the Hanley family, it's really this multi-generational line that really travels up to the present day. And I am so curious to know what Martha Hanley, for example, told her daughter Alice about her family's history of enslavement. I'm so curious to know, what the elder children understood about this. Clearly, we see that Martha and Mary were processing some of this about their family's history and leaving these little breadcrumbs in the SOHS archives and the Douglas County Museum archives for researchers down the road to find later. But I'm curious as to the role this played in their family's understanding of themselves. So the takeaway for me is that people brought this legacy with them here, and it's absolutely relevant history for our region. Okay, that's all I've got for today. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Anna, for taking the time to go through that really detailed look at first, like what this history looked like. You did a really good job of talking about the different types of methods that you had to go through, and how once you had compiled them, you were able to kind of layer them to see a fuller story. So great job in terms of giving us that peek behind the curtain, and also sharing this reality that is unfortunately often left out of the pioneer narrative, despite the fact that, as you've demonstrated, it was very much just part and parcel for what the reality was for these early pioneers that we look up to and we kind of raise on a pedestal. So I really appreciate the very thoughtful effort that you took to uplift this piece of this history, despite the fact that it's sometimes a little bit hard to look at, and to want to talk about. So thank you, first off and foremost, for all of your time on that. Um, I wanted to ask a couple questions that I had brewing. One of the most interesting things to me about the research that you did was that you're talking about a family that had the opportunity, unlike most families, to do some of this interpretation. They actually, had a hand in what this story would look like moving forward. And I find it really interesting. I find it not surprising at all that they might have left out this piece of the puzzle, because who wants to highlight the negative aspects of their family's history, just generally. But I find it interesting that they did leave the breadcrumbs. Can you clarify where? I know you for sure found some breadcrumbs that were like from their oral histories in Douglas County, but did you see? I just can't quite remember. Did you see that reflected in what you had at SOHS? Or was it more like purposely maybe left out, do you think? I'm curious what your thoughts are on that aspect of
Yeah,
it.
it's a great question, Mariah, because that was a surprise to me too. I thought we're gonna have to really dig deep and sort of see, find sort of the secret nooks here. So at SOHS, we've got about 12 manuscript boxes that are all the Hanley family papers. And the ones that I focused on for this talk were the ones related to the Burnett family lineage. And that's actually where I found those bills of sale, for example.
Right.
I'm trying to remember what were the other from, it's like it all blends together. My other
Yeah.
SOHS sources, the handwritten note, yeah, that said that
Yeah.
for sure there were people that came across. So as any historical society, it's like you have such a
Sure.
volume of materials
Hmm.
that until you really come at something with a specific research question, you're not going to sort of look through every sheet of paper within the hundreds of pages that are available for a family. So this stuff was really just there. It was in the Hanley family archives. That's in those boxes in our research library, not really hidden away at all, to my mind.
Mm.
um, it seemed it was clear to me that somebody previously had been doing this kind of research into the Hanley family, probably Hanley family members themselves.
Yeah, it seems like it, which is pretty incredible that that it wasn't something that was kind of necessarily like purposefully put under wraps, but just something that was left out. You make a great point about how
Absolutely. Yeah.
we still need to ask these questions because you might find answers to things that you don't even think you need to ask. So I'm glad that you could kind of illuminate that a little bit for us. I want to take a moment to point out that the McKee Bridge Historical Society, hey, mentioned that you did a great presentation. So it's good to hear also, just in terms of you mentioning them, that there is additional work being done to uncover the other stories, of whether or not folks have been enslavers throughout Oregon's history. But a really important question that I definitely want to make sure I get to from the chat is, what do you make of the fact that the Hanleys enslaved two people in 1855 after slavery in Oregon had been outlawed in 1853?
Great question. Uh, to that part of the history,
Mm.
where we see that there are people coming across the Oregon Trail with this family, um,
Mhm.
and it's so difficult to know what the context was and what the experience was, right? I know that I'm not surprised, let's put it that way, because I know some of the other work of Oregon Black pioneers and the fact that there were other families that did that in Oregon, sort of had an enslaved person come over with them and then perhaps offered their freedom or not, depending
Mm.
on the situation, after they got here. Um, yeah, I tend I I think it's terrible. It's
So fair.
hard to it's yeah, it's so hard. The the hardest part for me of, like, looking into this history is also, so I have a 4-year-old, right?
Yeah.
I'm imagining, how difficult an experience it was to cross the Oregon Trail,
Mm.
with a toddler. And the toddler at least one of them in this group was an enslaved person. Oh my
Mm.
goodness, right?
Yeah.
It's heart-wrenching. So, um, it definitely makes me, I think that we try in all of our interpretations not to place value judgments, not to glorify particular families and all that. It definitely
Mm.
gives, in terms of somebody who spends a lot of time with like the Hanley family's history in their house, talking
Yeah.
about them, engaging with who they were in the past and trying to like reflect that to people. It adds a layer of complexity for sure that I
Mm.
think is important to share. Yeah, that's not a very specific answer to that question. I think I'll be
So fair.
thinking about that question more as time goes on.
Yeah, no, totally fair. And actually, for clarification, do you, from what you were able to tell, did it seem like they were still considered by the family to be enslaved during their time here in Oregon? Because clearly you were able to uncover the fact that there were people who were at least formerly enslaved that were connected to this family and lived here with this, parts of this family.
Mhm.
So do you have any idea about whether or not they were enslaved during that time? A lot of times people were kind of converted to a servant. Um, and of course you can't, say for sure, obviously, about what their experience was. But in what you saw referencing them, did it seem clear one way or the other?
I think like half of the references referred to those people as enslaved and half
Okay.
referred to them as servants.
Sure.
So it's not clear, you know?
Hmm.
It's a really good question. And I wonder if it's possible too. So the fact that, this younger person, Lily, is listed as a part of the household in 1860. Again, I wish we could read that
Yeah.
handwriting that's next to it, because that would also give us some clarification as to
Mm.
like what somebody considered her role to be at that time. But yeah, and again, it's a lot of what I was able to find about that period of time was like clearly passed on through family oral history.
Hmm.
So who knows how clear it is.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
yeah, it's a really good question. It's a
It's a
really
good
good
question.
nexus for future research. Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly. And also it's just a great, um, you're doing the best that you can, and there are limits to what we're able to parse out in terms of like pieces of scanned cursive writing that are difficult to read. But if anybody in the future watching this has any insights, share them with us, and we'll definitely pass it along to Anna or anyone else doing research like this. But you definitely touched on it on the end of our presentation, of your presentation, as asked. But if you don't mind kind of summing it up, as we do get to the end of our episode here, I got to ask the question that I ask everyone, which is, how has what you uncovered changed our understanding of history?
Well, again, for me, absolutely. It's just drawing this very clear connection with
Hmm.
the history that we're experiencing here locally and interpreting locally in Southern Oregon, particularly at Hanley Farm, and legacies of enslavement.
Mm.
Um, I mean, it's just such a clear, it's such a clear connection now to me. And like you said before, it's interesting that the family did, keep these pieces of their family archive with the materials so that they were accessible, but obviously before this time, it hasn't been, like, a prominent part of the house tour that was, written by folks that knew Mary Hanley, etcetera.
Sure.
Um, but now that we have, like, sort of parsed this out a little bit more, I think it's a really important entree into being able to talk about it. We want to be able to
Mm.
talk about this part of history that really did impact Oregon and played a role in Southern Oregon pioneer families. So it feels like an opportunity to me. And I think it's one that we will absolutely be moving forward with. Um, in terms of our interpretation. So I could see this like in a practical way being, I think folks might remember from the slideshow, the ones of showing sort of interpretation at Hanley Farm, there's a picture, right, of Martha and Michael Hanley in their home, right?
Right.
So when the tour reaches that room, right, we say, and here, Martha and Michael Hanley, and here's their story of coming to Oregon, and the truth is that Martha Burnett Hanley's family had a history of enslavement as well. So now we know that there are these likely two women that came across with the family, and being able to sort of talk a little bit about that history feels like an important added layer of richness and complexity to the family story that I think we would welcome.
Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. And since Southern Oregon Historical Society is such a big institution, such an important institution to Oregon and specifically Southern Oregon, it is very important that you're taking these opportunities to tell more nuanced stories. Like history is so deeply nuanced, and being able to add all of the pieces to the puzzle just lets us all understand it a little bit better. So I think that you did a great job, and we really appreciate the time that you spent digging into this research and allowing sharing it with us tonight. So I just want to say that it's been wonderful learning from you this evening, Anna.
Oh, thanks so much, Maya. Thank you again so much for the opportunity. Again, this was of great benefit to me and us, as well as hopefully to you. And I'm really hoping that there's another installment of this in the future, and you can do some updates as we learn more.
That's definitely one of the goals of Black History Quest. The quest always continues. So hopefully there is an opportunity for us to continue digging into the story, and maybe someday we can find out a little bit more about Lyle and Lily, and maybe even see some photographs. I love that there is potentially that to look forward to in the future. So, but yeah, thank you so much, Anna. We really appreciate your time as a history investigator.
Thanks, Maya.
All right, so that'll do it for this episode of Black History Quest. As always, we want to thank the Collins Foundation for sponsoring this show. Make sure to learn more about them and the projects that they support beyond this one at collinsfoundation.org. And as you all know, Oregon Black Pioneers depends on the support of ordinary people who believe in sharing the stories of Oregon's Black history. So if you enjoyed this show or any of our previous episodes and would like to support it and other programs like this one, please consider a donation to Oregon Black Pioneers using the link that you can surely find or somewhere on our website. Now, if you have questions about this episode or would like to become a history investigator yourself, please send an email to hello@OregonBlackPioneers.org. We'd love to have you. And stay tuned for the next episode of Black History Quest in January, where, as always, we'll try to answer the question, how can one source change history? Thank you so much for joining us, and good night.